What if the greatest pain of your spiritual life is not that God failed you, but that religion taught you the wrong God? What if the version of God you inherited was shaped more by fear, contradiction, manipulation, performance, wounded authority, and family collapse than by God actually revealing himself? Because one of the deepest pains of my life was not only being in and around cultic religion, the deeper pain was carrying a gross misunderstanding of who God is. And that matters, because if you misunderstand God, you will also misunderstand love, fatherhood, correction, pain, identity, obedience, and your own worth. So this video is not anti-God. It's not anti-scripture, nor anti-study, and certainly not anti-truth. But it is about one question. Who taught you what God is like? And what did that image do to your life? Because religion is man defining God to you, versus a relationship is God defining himself for you. Maybe the thing that needs to die is not your hunger for God. Maybe the thing that needs to die is the false image that stood between you and him. Hello, friend. My name is Thomas Emmanuel Orms O'Brien. I'm the president and co-founder of Building a Home Inc. alongside my wife Vanessa. We introduce ourselves every single week because we understand that our verbiage is very unique to us. About myself professionally, for the last 10 years, I've been in the finance industry. Currently, I'm the account manager at a brokerage, and I assist the managing partner with his book of business that does over $14 million a year in gross revenue. Personally, I come from a broken home with an abusive biological father. I'm a former drug addict and alcoholic, rehabilitated habitual liar, and in 2022, I attempted suicide and survived. Shortly after that, I escaped a religious cult that my father had inserted me into at the age of 10. 2.5 years after my suicide attempt, I spent that time as an autodidact reverse engineering my own suicide and really doing my best to analyze what I was missing that led me to collapse. And that became known as our frontier program, known as the BHI framework. It is the philosophy that life is like a house and it must be built with intention. It covers the 7 architectural domains that make a human life inhabitable. That is love and truth, identity and integrity, physical and financial health, vocation or purpose, joy, release, and wisdom. If you had all of those things, by my estimation, you wouldn't be able to say that anything is missing. And that leads us to the field of study that I hope to establish in a new institute known as the Paleoanthropology of Wholeness. And its job is to do 3 things. Number 1, eliminate suicidal ideation across the globe in my lifetime. Number 2, capture back the definition of a perfect life and reinsert it into modernity. And number 3, assist in answering the 2 most important ontological questions that I believe are burned into the hippocampus of every single human being on the planet. That is, who am I and why am I here? My personal hope is that I can help you discover purpose through psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, history, economics, and value creation. Through these things, I think, are the keys to having a perfect life. This does not mean a life without pain or suffering, because that is the universal experience for every single human being on the planet. But it does mean a whole one. So with that in mind, let's get into today's video. So I can't really talk about God, my relationship with God, and who I am as a person now without going into a little bit of my history. And as I've stated before in these videos, we are a theistic company that does believe in the God of the Bible, expressed as the universal force of love perfectly in the person of Jesus. Now, if you're someone with atheistic tendencies, I understand that that explanation is most likely suboptimal for you, and I would love to discuss that in length. But I think today what's more important is to discuss how being raised in a broken home distorted who I believe God to be in this very moment. It took me a very long time to reach this point. A lot of suffering, a lot of study, and believe me, I've wanted to be an atheist many times in my life. But there are things that have occurred that I can only call anomalies, or in religious terms known as miracles, that would lead me to believe there is a designer behind this vast and most beautiful universe, and that he cares deeply for me as an individual. Before I was deeply conscious of doctrine as a child, I was conscious of life. I loved the world. I loved learning. I loved science. I loved dinosaurs, paleontology, marine biology, and discovery. And whatever language I had for God back then, he was not first a system to me. He was life. He was truth. He was love. He was the basis of reality. And as far as I can tell, that is the claim of classic theism. I'm talking about outside of the religious dogma that adds additional verbiage onto God, his characteristics, why he's here, all of those things. And my understanding growing up, classic theism was that God is life, truth, love, and the basis of reality. That matters because false religion did not first introduce me to God. In many ways, it distorted the God my heart was already reaching toward through wonder. And I asked my mom several weeks ago to describe how I was as a child before my family exploded. She said I was energetic, I was full of life, I was playful, obsessed with dinosaurs, Bible man, and my favorite hero of all time, El Zorro, the hero of California. And she said I was the happiest kid in the world. And I think there is no coincidence that being in love with life gave me a positive and beautifully reinforced image of the God of the universe. I love school. I was so curious. Other kids may have hated school, but I enjoyed school so much. I enjoyed learning. I enjoyed hanging out with my peers. I just had a voracious hunger for knowledge. And the thing is, though, because I was obsessed with dinosaurs, I immediately was confronted with the duality of what is known as creationist theology, which is breaking down to several different sub-doctrines, but it's basically religion's attempt to explain the creation story in the Bible, versus the more traditional scientific explanation, which is, deep time, the Big Bang, and evolution of life forms over a, let's say, 3 billion year period. But my main thing was dinosaurs. And I remember distinctly my parents just would tell me, don't listen to the evolution stuff, only listen to your love for dinosaurs. And so I consumed both both concepts. I would consume Christian creationist ideology through what is known as Answers in Genesis, I believe, and that is their foremost and premier media education publishing on paleontology and how they bridge the gap for what they believe to be the explanation of the Bible and science versus science and science explanation of um, paleontology, archaeology, anthropology, the whole nine. And, the tension for me was apparent immediately. And so my love for discovery immediately brought me to this place where at 5, 6, 7 years old, I was wrestling with what my family, my community, my pastors, teachers were telling me versus the compelling and empirically based data of science, and made it very difficult. But I don't necessarily remember if it affected my belief in God or not. Again, my obsession was with the dinosaurs themselves. And so, as I was highly, highly focused on Pachycephalosaurus, I wasn't necessarily asking the existential and ontological questions that I do now as a 5-year-old. Regardless, though, I remember that tension being there. And for me, wonder and truth seeking felt more natural than, religious system language. I saw no barrier between the love of God and the love of science. I saw no barrier between inhaling as much truth and information as possible and love for God. And I think sometimes what happens is that false religion does not first give a person God. It first distorts the wonder that was already opening them to him. And I have some of my personal notes here. I was so voracious for the discovery of the universe. When I excelled in school, I read books early and had lots of friends. And I just remember that despite going to church and reading the Bible, going to family small group, life was just God, this gift of existence. And it is very difficult to talk about a person's image of God without talking about family. As you know, we've discussed several times on this channel the importance of in utero to 12 years old when it comes to neurological development and psychological development in children. Those first 12 years are perhaps the most important. And, and the thing is, because children do not only learn doctrine from words, they absorb atmosphere, they absorb tone, they absorb contradiction, they absorb whether love feels safe or unstable. John Bowlby, the pioneer behind attachment theory. 5 different attachment types, only one is healthy and beneficial. If you happen to develop the other 4, those are maladaptive survival coping mechanisms. And so to develop secure attachment, you have to have love, safety, and predictability. And for me, at least at that time, before my parents' explosion, I did have that. And so I grew up in a family that professed Christianity and went to church. I won't say I knew where my parents' hearts were, but one of my earliest memories is hearing my parents argue at night after they put me to bed. And so publicly, we were a well respected family living the American dream. My biological father was working hard, my mother was working hard. We lived in a beautiful home. And we hosted, others hosted us. It was very much, you know, pleasant. And, publicly we looked respectable. But privately, obviously, something was wrong. And when you're a child, you may not even have language for that yet, but your nervous system knows. So I remember one night I heard my parents arguing, and I opened the door of my bedroom. And we lived in a two-story house where the bedrooms were on the second floor, and the living room, the den, the kitchen, the dining room, they were all on the first floor. And I went and I sat on the stairs and I listened to them argue. I don't remember what they were saying, but they were like yelling at the top of their freaking lungs. And excuse me. Um, I did that a lot. I would do that often until one night I got caught. After that, I didn't do it again. I was punished, and I stopped hearing my parents argue at night. So my assumption is that they just figure out a different place to do it, or stop doing it altogether. But that was, again, it was another contradiction that I was being presented. It was this professed Christian family that went to church and was respected in community, and yet the two people who were responsible for my love, safety, and predictability and our image to the world really were just like completely fractured. And so again, it left me with this sense of impending doom, but I don't remember it affecting my belief in God, nor my belief in science. But it certainly um, leaves you living in two realities. And as we are aware in trauma psychology, development of PTSD and information regarding childhood development in general, if that is an experience that is happening, it is very, very, very detrimental for the psyche and the brain development. So immediately when you are in an unstable home, your brain develops differently than everybody else. This is some of the latest science that is out. It has been corroborated by several sources: Dr. Bezel van der Kolk, Dr. Gabor Mate, and several others. But this matters more than most people think. I mean, they dismiss their childhood when they forget to understand that it is the key years of your life that propel you into a future of making choices that you're either conscious or subconscious of. Now, the choices are still yours that you make, but certainly the negativity of your childhood affects the choices you make in your adolescent and adult years. And this is something that we must destigmatize. We have to make normal this phrase. It's not your fault, but it's unfortunately your responsibility. And we have to destigmatize the fact that people make horrible decisions, not always because they're horrible people, but because they are pattern trained to do so. And this is just a search and admission of truth. We want to cast these wide judgments on others without having fully examined the circumstances of their lives. And this is lazy, and this damages, and this marginalizes, and this drives people to being alone. Because oftentimes I found myself doing things that I honestly didn't know why I was doing them. I would have adverse feelings toward them, and yet felt compelled to take my horrible task at the time to completion. And it took many years of work, I'm still working on it, to realize, wow, I did that, because of certain events in my life that trained my central nervous system to have pre-prescribed responses to certain stimulus. Now, does that excuse my behavior? Perhaps not, but certainly it sheds a light into care and compassion and graceful curiousness that we must ignite in ourselves and others once again. Because to seek the truth objectively is to seek for the whole truth, whether or not it fits your narrative. And I find myself consuming lots of content where people talk hand over fist, and they throw out these blanket statements when there are groups of millions of people that do not fit in that category. And I understand that not every content creator is going to be able to speak about these things in length that is corroborated with the empirical data and that is both confirmed in philosophy and religion. But regardless, I think we need to do a better job of making sure that we understand why people do the things that they do. In my personal belief, there is only one difference between a hero and a villain. A hero says, I won't let anyone experience the same pain that I have experienced again. The villain says, everyone is going to experience the pain that I have experienced. So it's only a slight pivot between one or the other. To become the hero is only a small stretch in the right direction. Yes, it is honorable and it is glorious. But a hero always has the capacity to be a villain, and a villain always has the capacity to be a hero. It's just easier as a society to forget that. And so, a child or a person's earliest theology is often not what the family says about God. It is what the home teaches about safety, love, truth, and contradiction. When my parents divorced, it felt like the floor opened up underneath me. And that was not just a family event. That was a collapse in reality. And if you know the science, it is not until beyond 12 that the child garners identity from their parents. Now they start to form and express and reveal who they are in the world in those younger years. But that process doesn't become complete until far later down the road. And so if a child experiences trauma before 12, there is an immediate stunting of that key brain development and that key psychological development. Right? And so when the first home collapses, a child often starts interpreting everything through the fracture, because that collapse is not only their present reality, but it becomes the basis for their reality. Trust gets hit, identity gets hit, belonging gets hit, safety gets hit. And because God language was already in the house, God gets interpreted through that collapse as well. A lot of people think theology is formed by sermons. It isn't. I think for a lot of people, theology is first formed by atmosphere, fracture, and the meaning that their body assigns to pain. I remember I was sitting on the living room floor working on a marine biology project, specifically sharks. I love sharks. That was when my biological father said to me, he was sitting on the couch behind me, and he said, "Son, your mother and I are getting a divorce." And I just remember this feeling of abyss. I didn't know what my life meant or how it was going to go. It was like I was free falling in darkness with no light. And the first home collapse is very difficult. And early trauma certainly affects the whole interpretive structure of life. And people, again, I think, are too easy to dismiss the damage that happens. One of the most crucial studies in child psychology, trauma psychology, neurological brain development was done in 1998. It was a longitudinal study known as the ACEs study, which is an acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences. I forget the number of the control group, but it was hundreds or thousands of individuals that were observed specifically in what would be called traumatic homes formating into adulthood. And they routinely checked in over the decades. And the individuals that came from a traumatic household, not only did they have problems with learning development in school, a large percentage of them were diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. They were the ones that went on to become delinquents in their adolescent years. They were the ones that went on to become the heavy drinkers and the drug users in college. They were the ones who dropped out of college. They were the ones that even if they happened to get a degree, they had trouble maintaining consistent jobs. And on top of all of this, they were the ones who had far more issues with their health than anyone else. Versus the kids who came from a family that stayed together was not without their challenges, as all families have them, but no trauma to speak of in terms of the 10 types of trauma that were being documented through the ACEs study. That's how they determine what your score is they have a 10-question diagnostic asking you very specifically if you experience certain things. Anyone with a 4 or over out of 10 had 40 to 50 percentile more chance for a life of despair. And by despair, I mean suffering in all categories of life. Lack of love and truth, identity, integrity, physical health, financial health, hobbies, right? Release and wisdom. All 7 architectural domains of inhabitable human life were adversely affected in the direction of despair of 40% or more. I have a score of a 9. So there is only one thing on that list that I did not experience, which I never experienced my biological father striking my mother. But everything else, from molestation to divorce to neglect to abandonment to physical violence to mental anguish to lack of admonition and in the presence of gambling, drinking, serial womanizing, the whole nine. And I don't say that to garner sympathy. I say that because I was so relieved to understand that the things that I was experiencing, my thought patterns, my decision making and critical thinking skills, were blunted by things that were outside of my control. And that there was actual science and language behind these things. And so, if the early home collapses, a child does not just struggle to trust people. He can start struggling to trust reality itself. Unfortunately, because of the dynamics of the relationship and how things worked out, my biological father became the main filter through which I understood God. And that is dangerous when the father himself is manipulative, unstable, and wounded. As I've mentioned many times before, my biological father was an ex-felon. He was a gambling addict. He was an alcoholic. He was a smoker. He was a serial womanizer. And um, he also was severely traumatized. He had received abuse from his mother and his father, my grandparents, and in many ways worse than my own. So he was only giving to me what he had. He didn't know anything else. Now, does that excuse his behavior? No, it does not. Does that remove the hurt and the damage that it has caused in my own life, that it has caused my mother's life, our family's lives? No, it does not. But to give you an idea of kind of who he was early on, at 9 years old, one of the lines he used on me as a child, and used it often, was this: if you do not do this, you do not love me. He would ask me to lie on his behalf. Um, he would ask me specifically to lie to my mother. And if I didn't do it, he said, you don't love me. And he would ask me to do things that I was not comfortable with. And that changes everything. Because now love is no longer unconditional. Love becomes performance. Love becomes compliance. Love becomes managing someone else's emotional world so you can stay connected. Because as a child at 9 years old, if you lose that connection, you die. That is the evolutionary, biologically sound truth. Without connection, at 9, I die. So, what would a child in that situation prioritize? The connection, because that is what your brain, primarily as a survival mechanism, is designed to do. Even though that connection was death, was destruction, was pain, was suffering. And so when scripture says God is love, but the father image in your life has already taught you that love is conditional and manipulative, your image of God starts distorting too. And really, my father became my God, because I would just listen to everything he had to say. I wanted his love so desperately that I waited on him hand and foot. And whatever he said about God, I believed it. Now, at this time, he started to move towards cultic religious practice. And at 10 years old, he inserted us into a religious cult. And from then on, I don't want to say I was doomed, but I certainly was placed in a very disadvantageous position when it comes to God. And here's the thing: if love becomes performance in the home, God as Father can start feeling less like safety and more like pressure. One of the deepest patterns I saw growing up was this: wounded men using religion as camouflage. I watched public respect and private destruction live inside the same person. I watched God language, intelligence, leadership access, and religious literacy wrapped around lying, manipulation, addiction, theft, fracture, and hidden darkness. That does something to a child. Because now God gets associated with several key factors: public image, private contradiction, leaders who sound holy but deform lives, and systems that reward appearance more than integrity. One thing that my biological father was always very skilled at is that he would ingratiate himself with leadership in whatever community he decided to insert himself into. And that was to do what he knew best: which was to garner defense for when inevitably he would damage the very people in the community he inserted himself into. I saw it over and over and over again. He would be the chameleon. He would be who he needed to be so that he could get grace. And then he would borrow thousands of dollars from people and never pay them back. He would sleep with the women of these congregations. He would lie. He would cheat. And eventually it would implode in his face. But he would have that image that he projected straight to leadership that would sort of be his parachute, as it were, to keep him from falling flat and splatting all over the ground. And it was really, really hard. It was really hard. And the thing is, too, he was never sure of who he was or what he wanted to be. When my parents got divorced, he, as a self-professed Christian, left Christianity and dove headfirst into Orthodox Judaism and started to implant within me Jewish rhetoric, Jewish ideology, Jewish religious practice, Jewish ideas. And it became a part of my identity. So I thought, well, half Jewish and half not. And because he already was poisoning me against my mother in a myriad of different ways, I started to even resent Christianity because, in a sense, my mother represented the church and my father was the rebellious Jew. And it was something else. But what ended up happening to me, unfortunately, is that I attended a private Christian school growing up. And that was something that my mother tried her best to do, despite being a single mom who worked 2-3 jobs at a time to keep a roof over our head. But that meant, I didn't get new clothes every year for school, or new shoes, or a new backpack, or a new lunchbox. A lot of it was hand-me-downs and the same things all the time. So I would get bullied. I would get bullied because I would wear one pair of shoes every single day, year round. I would shuffle between 3 to 4 pairs of pants, 5 to 6 shirts, over and over and over again. And I also gained a significant amount of weight because my mother at the time, she had to focus on speed and efficiency. So I ate a lot of cereal. I ate a lot of TV dinners. I ate a lot of frozen chicken tenders and French fries. I ate a lot of pasta, a lot of fast food, a lot of things that are absolutely horrible that you should eat sparingly, if never, in your life. And I developed, health problems because of my diet. As we are aware now, the gut-brain axis is perhaps more important than any other function in the entirety of your body, aside from your other primary organs. Over 70% of the serotonin in your body is produced in your gut. So even how you feel and your mental health is largely determined by what you eat and the diversity of your gut microbiome, if it's healthy. And so I got bullied for being fat. And I also was an only child. So I didn't have siblings to share in my misery. I had no one to talk to. I spent a lot of time alone at home, alone at school, alone in my head. And a lot of alone time. But because I've always been, semi-intelligent, ADD as a neurodivergent, I had a explosive and very vivid imagination, so I would figure out ways to keep myself occupied and cope with being alone. But what ended up happening was that I snapped one day in PE afterwards in the locker room, I got in a fight with my biggest bully. I mean, this specific young man just like lived to terrorize me every day. I was his sole target. He didn't bother anyone else. He, from my perspective, he wanted me to die. I mean, this guy was relentless in his pursuit. And one day I just snapped. Because as you know, anyone who comes from a broken home, a lot of the emotional anguish is very dysregulated. And so I definitely had anger management problems. I would have, manic outbursts of anger. And so I ended up putting my hands around his throat and squeezing as hard as I could until I snapped out of it. And it was clear that I was the victor of our engagement, and he didn't like that. So, being the most popular kid in school as well, he rallied everyone around him, and then I was truly alone. So, 150 kids in my 6th grade class, and he convinced every single one to hate my guts. And I ended up getting called to the dean office, as one does when you get in a fight. And I explained the years of torment, the bullying that I had received at the hands of this individual. And the dean looked me square in the face, this Christian man, dean of a Christian school, and he says, "We have a no-nonsense policy for violence." He disregarded what was probably a 30-minute plus explanation of my life, but also cry out for justice and relief. And it was like I hadn't spoken a word. And I just remember him looking at me and saying, "We have a no-nonsense policy when it comes to violence." So I was failed. I was failed by the schooling system that preferred image over justice, that preferred religious ideals over humane love and care for the child in a precarious situation. And I was probably the only child that came from a divorced family. Everybody else came from this perfect white picket family. They all had considerable more resources than I had. And so I was the poor, fat, bullied, divorced, and at that time what I believed to be half Jewish kid. And so I went home and I told my mom, I said, "If you don't take me out of this school, I'm going to kill myself." And being the loving mother she is, she got me out of there. But this is what happens is when wounded men stand between people and God. People do not just get bad teaching. They can get a damaged soul. One of the most destructive things false religion did to me was make me suspicious of good things. I was suspicious of love. I was suspicious of joy. I was suspicious of beauty. And I was suspicious of what felt alive and right. I was taught in effect that if something was too good, too beautiful, too full of life, it probably was not God, because I needed to kill my flesh. And that God would rather I betray my heart than trust goodness. And that is a devastating God image, because it teaches you that God is not the source of life, but the enemy of joy. And after I dropped out of college, I moved back in with my biological father, and I met my neighbor. Her name was Vanessa. She was the most beautiful woman that I had ever seen on the entire planet. She was the kindest soul. She was the embodiment, and still is the embodiment for me of God's love on earth. Now, we're married, but I didn't trust that. I didn't trust that I deserved to be with the woman that was perfect. I didn't trust that I deserved to fall in love. And unfortunately, one of the ways that my biological father harmed me is that he said, God does not want you to marry a beautiful woman because then you will no longer think about God. For context, he was in a relationship with a woman that he didn't want to be with, who had been cheating on him for years. And he wasn't man enough to remove himself from that situation. Mostly because at this time, at however old, 46, he had convinced her and everyone else that he couldn't work. And so she was his source. She was fairly successful. She made 6 figures a year. And they had a horrible marriage. That's absolutely horrible. I mean, they drank, they smoked, and she was cheating on him. But he didn't care about dignity. He didn't care about light, love, truth, happiness. He just cared about getting that paycheck to support him and his life and everything he wanted to do. He gambled away all of her money. That poor woman. But at the same time, poor him, right? And so what ended up happening was that Vanessa and I, we were together for about a year and a half. I had asked her to marry me. But because my father's claws and his idea of God was so deep embedded within me, I broke off the engagement. And I remember for 2 weeks, I couldn't even come out of my room. My heart was not even in my body anymore. It was completely detached on the floor, swept under the bed. And I believe that lie, that if it's too good, it cannot be God. And my fear was calling itself obedience. And the cost of distrusting goodness is this. Number one, I broke the most amazing woman on earth. I broke her heart into 1 billion pieces. And then I went and got with someone else out of hating myself, hating my father, hating God. I married someone I didn't like. I married someone that I believed I deserved to be married to. And for 5 years, I was in an absolutely horrible relationship. And despite being a woman who had the capacity to make her own choices, Vanessa also went and married someone that she believed she deserved, because when I broke her heart, her idea of a good, loving God that wanted her to be with a man that she was in love with, despite I don't know what she saw in me back then. She always said to me, I don't care what anyone says about you. I see who God told me you are, is what she said. And that's how I know because she fell in love with me when I was in recovery, $0 net worth, when all I had to offer her was a deep desire to get well and unlimited potential. But everything else was zero. In fact, most of my faculties were in the negative. But she said, I love you because God told me who you are. It could be, delusion. It could all be fake. But I am partially, in a big way, who I am today because of her. And I will never, no matter how successful I get, ever have to worry about whether her love for me is solid. She loved me when I was not just nothing, less than nothing. And so now part of why I do this is because I want to give her the world. I want to build a business that's successful so that she can live in the lap of luxury for the remainder of her days. But that's the cost. When you believe God doesn't want you to be happy, when you believe that God doesn't want you to have good things, to experience beauty, to be full of life, it will destroy you. And false religion can train people to call fear holiness and betrayal of good things obedience. Bad doctrine is not just wrong information. It can become a wound because doctrine does not stay on paper. It enters the nervous system. It enters identity. It enters relationships. It enters shame. It enters despair. When I attempted suicide in 2022, I was not only in pain, I was trapped inside a God image and a religious framework that had made life feel unlivable. And that is what I mean when I say bad doctrine can wound a life. This is part of why I speak with stakes now. Whatever you take away from this video, whether you're a theistic or an atheistic person, I do not want people to suffer unwittingly and unnecessarily the way I did. So yes, some suffering forms you, but there is also suffering that comes from lies, false authority, distortion, and not knowing what truth could have protected you from. And so, what I want you to know is that if a version of God makes life feel unlivable, if you have this gnawing fear and anxiety every single day, that doesn't prove God is evil or that he doesn't exist. I think it proves that the image is false. Because a God cannot be all loving and all good if you have to live a life of despair. Hell may be a place, but if all you're worried about day in, day out of your life is whether or not you end up there in the end, your life will be dictated by fear. And the Bible says in 1 John chapter 4, verse 18, perfect love casts out all fear. And so you have to shift your gaze. Otherwise, you will never have the capacity to see the light if all you look at is darkness. And I'm not talking about evil, which unnecessary suffering is evil, I believe. But it says this exactly, and I'm going to quote it. It says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. So, what I think the Apostle John here is saying is not a person who decides to embark on the biblical journey won't feel fear again. He's not saying that anxiety automatically proves you don't know God, nor is he saying that maturity means total emotional calm at all times. There's an aspect of maturity, but I think it's more specific than that. I think it's as God's love is truly received and matured in a person, fear of punishment and rejection before God loses its hold. So when I say religion must die on this channel, here's what I mean. It does not mean truth must die, nor scripture, nor wisdom. It doesn't mean study must die. And it doesn't mean real community must die. I mean this. Whatever places man between God and the human soul must die. In the entirety of all Near Eastern ancient manuscripts, including the Bible, the antithesis is religion. They all speak about a relationship with God. And relation is interpersonal. It has nothing to do with anybody else. Now, does that not mean relationship does not allow you the opportunity for community? That's not true. Because a relationship with God scripturally clearly stipulates that love is extended to everyone else around you as a byproduct of that relationship. But fear-based mediation must die. Performance as belonging must die. Man defining God for you as the final authority must die. Inherited God images that produce hiding, shame, fragmentation must die. Systems that do not trust God to transform hearts must die. But what stays alive is truth. What stays alive is Jesus. What stays alive is love. What stays alive is wonder, responsibility, the search for truth. You see, I think you cannot be someone who loves God if you're unwilling to be an atheist. What do I mean by that? The search for truth stands above all. Because if God is the basis of reality, which is the classic claim of theism, then understanding reality goes beyond being a religious person, reading the Bible, utilizing religious terminology. Your search must super exceed being a religious person. And I think that is why when people search the truth, they leave religion. But I hope in this video to compel you to praise yourself for leaving religion. Perhaps reanalyze what it might mean for a relationship with God. And so what I eventually began to realize was this, that the deepest pain was not just being around religion. The deepest pain was carrying a false image of who God is, when who he actually is the most amazing Father and the most loving force in the universe. When I started shifting my perspective, the same day I committed suicide, I made a decision. I said, number one, I believe that if I'm alive, God exists. I ran an algorithm with an AI program that was corroborated by the Department of Transportation's data in my city on the night of my car accident. That was my suicide attempt. I was going 85 miles an hour at 11 p.m. on the highway with no one else around, and I closed my eyes and let go of the wheel. My vehicle drifted all 3 lanes over and perfectly went in between a median and a light pole with less than a 1-inch deviation from either side. The AI algorithm said I had a 0.01% chance of survival. Now, an atheist would say, well, hey man, that's just the math. Congratulations. The thing is, I was contemplating my own existence and the existence of God in that moment. And so causation may not be correlation there. But when I decided that if God does exist, then he loves me. And if he loves me, everything in my life up until this point has been for a very specific reason, and anything that happens after that point would be for my benefit and nothing else. And so when I started to live that way and believe that way, even though it's been very hard, my life has changed dramatically. And so maybe you don't hate God. Maybe you hate the false image of God that was handed to you. So here's the next brick. If I may, I would like to invite you into a challenge. Write down the version of God you inherited, not the polished one, the real one, the one your nervous system believes. And I want you to ask several core questions. Number one, who gave you that image? What fruit did it produce? Did it teach you love or fear? Truth or hiding? Relationship or performance? Wholeness or fragmentation? And did it make you more alive and honest or more ashamed and split? And then ask one final question. What do I need to study honestly for myself? Because just as Louis Pascal, one of the greatest mathematicians and philosophers of our time, in my opinion, he was the proponent of what's known as Pascal's wager. He said, I'm going to live as if a God exists, as opposed to dismissing it entirely. Because I think relationship with God begins when responsibility returns to the person standing honestly before him. So my advice would be this. Do not outsource your relationship with God. Seek the truth for yourself. Study seriously for yourself. If you care about it, if you care about something, you want to become masterful. Test fruit. And if I may, let God define himself. So, what if religion taught you the wrong God? Then the greatest pain of your spiritual life may not be that God failed you. It may be that fear, manipulation, contradiction, wounded authority, and false doctrine were standing where the Father should have been. And if that's you, hear me carefully. Maybe the thing that needs to die is not your hunger for God. Maybe the thing that needs to die is the false image that keeps you from him. Religion is man defining God to you. Relationship is God defining himself for you. And the deepest pain is not only that people are religious. The deepest pain is that false religion can deform the image of the Father, when who he actually is the most amazing Father and the most loving force in the universe. So tell the truth. Examine the image you inherited. Test the fruit. Seek honestly. let God define himself. Pain doesn't get the final word. False religion does not get the final word. The house can be rebuilt brick by brick. There are 727,000 people a year that commit suicide. That's 1,992 people a day. If you got value from this video, please subscribe, hit the bell notification so that you don't miss when we go into the deep topics that I believe are most importantly explored by every single human being on the planet. I would love to continue exploring them with you. If you want some accountability in your journey and you want to rebuild with a community of people that are propelled by truth and love, that want to change the world, I would invite you to join us in school. It's free. We do live calls every week. And we have tools, resources, and implementation available for you there. Here's my call to action for you. Write down the version of God you inherited and audit its fruit honestly before the day ends. This has been Thomas Emmanuel Arms, soon to be O'Brien. I love you. See you next week.